In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
If you look at the numbers for startups, you'll see that there are far fewer women than men who launch startups, that there are racial biases in startups, that there's all sorts of things that hold people back because they don't see themselves as founders. And that hurts not just them because they're not launching a startup company they could, but also society because we get a lot less interesting and diverse startups than we would before. So I think the biggest myths to me are the ones about who should start a company, because those are what's stopping people from even getting going.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 65 of the Culture Lab podcast. So before I introduce my guest today, I have a question. Can you imagine scaling your business with virtually zero growing pains? Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, it's possible, and many founders and CEOs can attest to that. Listen till the very end of this episode to hear one of them, Darius Mirshadeh, sharing his experience of growing a company from 3 employees to 1,000 in just 3 years. But as with everything, there is a catch. You need to do some groundwork first. And a great place to start is creating and activating a culture playbook. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, no worries, I've got you covered. I actually created a free guide to introduce you to the concept of a culture playbook and to help you evaluate how good yours is at the moment. So to download the guide, just go to my website, agabayer.com. That's agabajer.com. Find the tab called Resources in the top right corner and click on the Culture Playbook Guide. And here is another question for you. What does a successful startup founder look like? Well, if you're anything like the majority of people out there, you probably have a vivid picture in your head. 2 supercharged recent college graduates that are just bursting out of the gate with a fresh new idea that hits them like a lightning bolt, gets massive funding, and leads to a product launch that is an astounding success. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Apple, these are all companies we know and think about when we are asked about entrepreneurial stories, the legendary unicorns with valuations over $1 billion. The only problem? The stories we tend to think about are stories of outliers. Because research shows that the most successful founders look and behave very differently. And my guest today is Ethan Mollick, an award-winning researcher at Wharton and the author of a new book, The Unicorn's Shadow: Combating the Dangerous Myths That Hold Back Startups, Founders, and Investors. His mission is to bust the myths that jeopardize entrepreneurial success and to democratize entrepreneurship. And in this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the characteristics of a successful entrepreneur, why partnerships between founders often fail, and what you can do to prevent it. Finding and nurturing a great business idea. We also talk about pitching to investors, when and how company culture gets imprinted in the fabric of your company, and much, much more. So, ladies and gents, without further ado, here is Professor Ethan Mollick. Ethan, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm really excited for you to be our guest. A lot of our listeners are founders, entrepreneurs. So I'm sure that people are going to be super interested in what you have to say. And we are going to talk about your new book. Congratulations.
Thank you
very much. It has just come out, I think, right? 23rd of June?
Yes, very recently, yes.
Yeah. Congratulations. But before we talk about entrepreneurship, I would like to ask you to tell me a little bit about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. How did you grow up and what mark did it leave on you?
So that's a really interesting question. I grew up in the Midwest of the U.S. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my father was an independent dentist, so a little bit of entrepreneurship in the family as he built his business. For me, things really kicked off in this sort of entrepreneurial angle when, after college, I was invited by a college roommate to start a company with him. And we did pretty well. We actually were some of the inventors of the paywall. So that thing that everybody hates now that prevents you from getting access to things, but journalists love. And so I was in my sort of early 20s and trying to sell enterprise software that we had just made up to large publishers. And we succeeded. We did pretty well, but I literally made every possible mistake. And I'm sort of an academic at heart. So after realizing we messed up in every way, even though the company was very successful, we ended up exiting and selling. We lived through the late 90s internet boom and survived through the other side before exit. I decided I want to learn how to do things right. So I decided to go get an MBA. I went to MIT to get an MBA and realized that nobody really knew how to do entrepreneurship correctly. So I decided to get a PhD and study it myself. And that's sort of been the story ever since, has been trying to understand this field that seems like magic and trying to add some actual research and data to it. And there's lots of other people doing this now too. And it's a really exciting place to be.
It is. And I have to say that I was so happy to find out about your book because it was really needed. So your book's title is The Unicorn's Shadow: Combating the Dangerous Myths That Hold back startups, founders, and investors. And what I love about this book is that it's not an opinion piece. Everything that you share is evidence-based. In your view, you talk about a number of myths in your book. Which is the most dangerous myth that holds back startups? What is something that can really destroy you if you believe in it?
So I think there's probably two flavors of most dangerous myths. There are dangerous myths that can cause you damage if you believe them and you're launching a company. But then there's the even more dangerous myths that stop people from even launching a startup company. If you look at the numbers for startups, you'll see that there are far fewer women than men who launch startups, that there are racial biases in startups, that there's all sorts of things that hold people back because they don't see themselves as founders. And that hurts not just them because they're not launching a startup company they could, but also society because we get a lot less interesting and diverse startups than we would before. So I think the biggest myths to me are the ones about who should start a company, because those are what's stopping people from even getting going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually a good sort of moment to give a shout out to some of the companies and some of the studios that have as their mission to help people who wouldn't normally found a company, create a company, giving them this opportunity and trying to create diversity in the entrepreneurial world. It's great to see this happening. I don't know whether you know a lot of investors who do this consciously. What is your experience?
So I'm a huge fan of doing this consciously, but the amazing thing to me is that we have a lot of evidence that doing it non-consciously or doing it just to make money also works. So, for example, if female entrepreneurs are more likely to start new companies around technologies or markets that other male entrepreneurs wouldn't have spotted, that tend to be more female-oriented, which is half of society. In fact, if there was more investment in female founders, venture capitalists would see higher returns. So I'm all for conscious efforts to do this, but I also hope that more people recognize that this is also a way to get rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's business case for that very clearly, and for diversity generally. not just gender diversity. Another interesting thing that I read in your book and I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned the survey where venture capitalists say that according to what they see, 65% of the times, the reason that startups fail is because there is an issue with a senior management team. So what in your experience usually goes wrong, if it's true?
So, I think that if it's true is important, because when you ask anybody about why their company failed, there's actually a really cool study that shows that they're almost always wrong, that people tell stories about why their company failed that either serve an emotional purpose for them or to shift blame. But I think it's a good indicator, I think, that the senior management team is a huge nexus for company failure. And a lot of things go wrong, but that's where the human element starts to come in. So you have a group of founders who start a company together, and oftentimes they are naive about what working together is going to be like. They're naive about how long the startup is going to last. They get resentful about how rewards are distributed. And so you end up having sort of arguments and messy divorces, but you can't just split up a company. So those things can actually poison startups if you don't get that people element right from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned in your book, actually, that it's important for the founders to have an agreement early on how they want to run things. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about this. So what are the important issues that you believe founders should discuss at the very beginning to avoid problems in the future?
Yeah, so we find that founders agreements, research shows founders agreements are associated with about 3 times higher chance of success. So,
Wow, 3 times higher.
the
That's,
thing, yeah.
yeah, that's super impressive.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it is it's not just because they're not magical, right? It's an indicator that you're going through a thoughtful process. So thoughtfulness is really important for startups. I think we think about a bias towards action, and that's really important, but thoughtful action is important. So if you don't have a founders agreement, it means you haven't sat down and thought through the issues about who's doing what, who's being rewarded, when are people going to, be rewarded for what they're doing, who's doing the most work. So I recommend people think about 3 categories of things. There's this concept called the Johari window that was popularized by Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War, who said, there are known knowns, which are things we know we know. There are known unknowns, which are things we now know we don't know. And there are unknown unknowns, which are things we don't know we don't know. And everyone kind of laughed at it. But it's a really good statement of epistemology. So you think about the known knowns. So what do you know? Who's put what money into the business so far? How do we deal with that? Who came up with the idea? You want to set up for known unknowns, which are things like who's going to work in the future, what's going to happen, who's going to raise money for us. And you do that through things like having equity agreements that involve vesting. So that helps solve that problem. And then you have to build trust for unknown unknowns. What happens when COVID occurs or some other unexpected thing? How do we build enough trust so that we can create new ways of working together? So that's a framework to think about as you're starting any organization.
Yeah, I love that. I really think that it's extremely important. And for some reason, I think when you ask people why they don't do this, they usually will just say, well, things just move so fast. We never really thought that it would be important. But I can see how that would really triple the chances of success of those teams when you think those things through. So that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. And obviously, to be successful, you also need to have a really good idea. And so my next question is, what is the best method of identifying and developing a startup idea?
Really good question. And if I had the magical answer, I would probably either be handing that out freely or else I would be running many more startup companies. But there's a bunch of stuff that can work, right? And so one of the things I suggest in the book is I give a bunch of research-based methods that work. There is a really cool set of research on what's called the principles of effectuation, which seem to be very useful for a lot of entrepreneurs. And the principles of effectuation are when Sarah Sarasvathy, who's a professor at UVA, examined successful founders, she found they thought a little bit differently about how to come up with ideas than conventional companies thought. And the way they thought about ideas was they started with themselves. They started by asking about who they were, what they knew, and who they knew. And they assembled a company sort of backwards from their own competitive advantage. So that's an interesting way to start, is to start with, like, what do I know that other people don't know? What connections do I have that I can take advantage of? And what resources do I have that I could take advantage of? And if you start from that kind of process, that can be very helpful, because it's not about creating something no one's heard of. It's about creating something that you know there's a problem and you have the resources at hand to solve them.
Yeah. Do you have an example to share with us of someone that you know that really did a good job with that and really managed to leverage who they were, who they knew, and what they knew?
Sure. And the example I give in the book is actually an interesting one, I think. So let's time travel back to the late 1990s, when there was a brief boom in virtual reality back then. So I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it was briefly a very cool thing that we'd all be living in virtual reality. And of course, the computers at the time couldn't handle it. It rapidly became, a sort of a mocked point because it couldn't live up to the vision. And virtual reality sort of went away after venture capital and people put money into it, and sort of the boom failed. So there was a long period of time where virtual reality was sort of a mocked thing, but hobbyists, as hobbyists do, always sort of slave away at the interesting concepts and behind the scenes, while the main interest of the sort of venture capital and startup world is elsewhere. And so there was a dedicated community of hobbyists building virtual reality rigs at home. One of them was a guy named Palmer Luckey. And Palmer was a bit of a boy genius as far as this was concerned, and was developing his own VR headsets, and had a group of enthusiasts who were really interested in what he did, including some very influential people in the world of video games, like John Carmack, who invented Doom. And people were really interested in his designs. And at one point he said, okay, people are interested in my designs. I know this community really well. I am going to create a product for them. So he created something called the Oculus Rift. And there's this great post on the online community forums where he's like, hey guys, if I did a Kickstarter for this, would you be interested? I don't really want to make any money beyond sort of beer and pizza money and to make back the money from my initial idea. But if people have ideas of what I should do, let me know. If you have a better name, let me know. So he launched this idea on Kickstarter. It raised a couple $100,000. And then it was later bought by Facebook for $2 billion.
Wow.
And so if you think about Palmer, what he did is he started with something he knew, virtual reality. He started with the connections he had in this industry. He understood very well what people wanted in that area, and started the Oculus Rift Kickstarter based on the community he was able to build. So that's a really nice example of starting with who you are, what you know, and who you know.
Yeah, I love that example. It's really great. And since you talked about Kickstarter, I think it takes us to this topic of investment and what do you have to keep in mind when you think about raising money and about investors? So what would be your advice to someone who's considering, where do I find the money for my idea? What are the best? Well, first of all, maybe not only the best pathways that people could take, but also what are the sort of things that we should be aware of when we consider various possibilities?
So money is interesting. The first thing you kind of have to realize is the startup world has changed very rapidly. So when I launched my startup company, the cost of launching a web-based startup was very expensive. Today, it's very cheap. There's an estimate that it's dropped by about 3 orders of magnitude. So it used to cost you $1 million to launch a web-based startup. Now you could do it for $10 in your kitchen, right? So because of that, the funding landscape has kept shifting because the cost of launching a startup has dropped. So there's now many ways to raise early stage money for your startup. Later stage money still requires things like venture capitalists or private equity if you want to raise millions of dollars of cash. But there's now lots of ways of raising capital early on. So crowdfunding and grant money works actually quite well in this, and thinking about things like angel investment and accelerators. So these are all big topics. Happy to discuss any of them. But there's now many choices available in the early stages of launching a startup company.
I think one thing that I'm particularly interested about coming at the startup world from this angle of someone who helps them with their culture is that very often when you have investors who expect fast returns on their investment, that has an impact on your company's culture, and it's not always a positive impact. So I was wondering whether you could speak to this and what would be the alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's understudied. Culture is such a underemphasized part of what makes startups successful. We have a lot of evidence of that. And I think you're right in that if the mission is we need to sell out quickly, that can cause people to internalize the fact that the product doesn't need to be great. And it can also, people are wrong about how long it takes to exit a company. So on average, it takes over 5 years. If you're sort of going for the quick win, you're not going to build something that can last, and you're not going to last through the ups and downs that are going to happen over 5 years. So I think you're right. Building the right kind of culture and building an organization that's designed to last rather than something that's designed to just live until you can get exited is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And in your experience, and I don't know if you can put a number on that or any other factors that play into that, how many of startup founders go into business to exit, and how many of them really see it as a long haul kind of thing where they just want to create a company that will last?
We don't have direct answers on that. I think that a lot of people who want to exit and might sort of give that idea in their culture that this is what they want to do won't admit it publicly in a survey because you're supposed to sound like you're in it for the long haul. But as I think you know, employees can pick up on cultural differences pretty quickly, right? So the surveys don't always tell us. We do know from surveys that say 2/3 of small business owners don't intend to grow their company, don't intend to exit, just want to keep it stable. So it's hard to know for sure.
This is a trend that I think is really picking up in popularity. So I hear a lot of voices that say today, growth is not it's not the main goal, and it's about having the right size for our lifestyle and for the business. And so I'm wondering whether you see this as well. Has it changed over the years? Because it feels like we've put a brake a little bit on how fast we want our companies to grow.
Well, it's hard to know, right? So there's a sort of derisive term in Silicon Valley for these kind of for a business you don't want to grow, and they call it a lifestyle business, right? Which is, I think, unfairly derisive because there's nothing wrong with a lifestyle, right? That's what we all want to have. So the contrast between a lifestyle business and is a business for people with no life, I guess. But I think that there's always been this idea that if you look at what's successful, and even my data shows this, family business is successful, right? That's not an emphasized thing in the culture of startups. So I think it depends on whether you're talking about a Silicon Valley style high growth startup or not. But I've always thought a large part of startups have been about stewardship and maintaining a size rather than growing infinitely.
Yes. So you've mentioned that culture in startups is an area that hasn't really been studied in depth. So I'm wondering, have you come across any evidence around the role that culture plays in success of startups?
Actually, there is a lot of work on culture. I just meant there wasn't a lot of work on whether or not people are trying to exit quickly, what percentage of people are trying to exit quickly. So culture has actually been really well studied because it's super interesting. Because when you think about startups, there are two things, right? We think about the struggle of a founder trying to launch a company, but also startups are baby companies, right? So where does culture come from in large organizations? Often from the very early days of the company. In fact, culture gets fixed early on in new organizations. There's a really cool study looking at the birth of the Paris Opera several hundred years ago. And you can actually see the elements of the founders' cultural choices in the opera today. So culture tends to get fixed early on and changes very slowly. I'm sure that's something you've seen in your work with companies.
Absolutely. And actually, I will just helping startups to figure out and maybe articulate what the purpose is and mission and vision and values. I don't work with them on the present and on the future. I first work with them on their story of origin, because there are so many things there where you can immediately see what was important, how they went about difficult challenges in their past, and what things they put first above anything else. So I absolutely agree. And then they really carry this through the years.
Yeah, we call this process imprinting, just like having sort of a small, a new puppy who learns to like you for the rest of their life. In the same way,
Yeah.
startups get imprinted by their founders in the very early days. And good founders are conscious of the imprint that they're putting in the company. Because I think, as you were telling us, unpicking that imprint, trying to put a new imprint in an organization is very hard. So building the culture the right way is really important. We know that companies that switch cultural models have spikes in mortality. They're more likely to fall apart afterwards. So there's a really nice study out of Stanford that looked at this, that said that basically a bad culture that's consistent is better than switching frequently between bad cultures to find a good one. So there is this idea that switching, people can learn to live with many things. They can't learn to live with change. So it's actually very hard to change stuff after you're underway.
Yeah. It's fascinating, because at the same time, you would think, because the world around us is changing and changing so rapidly, that in order for your culture to be able to deliver what you need for it to deliver, it has to evolve all the time. And so I wonder what scale these changes had that was so disruptive to the companies, because I would assume that probably evolution in culture is something that is probably positive. It helps a company to adapt and survive.
Exactly right. So slow changes don't have the same cost, but these are often organizations that went through a refit. So they started off as a family, oriented culture where everyone's committed to the company and to each other. And then they switch, they IPO and they get a new CEO and they switch to a different culture. So evolution is very reasonable, and guiding change is really important. It's just hard to make like sharp breaks in organizational culture, right? Because the stuff that, is at the surface of culture is in sort of the edge shine iceberg model of culture, right? The surface stuff that you could change is only a small piece of culture. Culture is mostly under the waterline where you can't see it. So it's hard to make those changes without causing disruption and issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why so many mergers actually are not a success, because it's so difficult to make two cultures that are so completely different work together. So that's really fascinating. And so from your point of view, if you were to advise someone on how to go about cultivating culture in their startup, what would you say? What are the most important things to get right at the very beginning?
So consistency, which is one of the things we talked about, and also just knowing yourself, right? So, it ties together two threads we brought up earlier in this conversation. The first is that the people in your company kind of know what your goals are. So you should be honest about your goals and what kind of company you want to build, and make sure you're hiring people and building culture around those goals rather than diluting yourself, right? If you don't care about society, right? And you just want to make a quick buck, hiring a bunch of people and saying we care about the environment and social change, that's going to become very transparently not true. And you're going to have trouble maintaining that organization, right? So being clear about what you want to accomplish and how, and hiring for that is one important thread, right? And then the other is spending time as a founder early on building the right imprints. So there's a lot of menus to pick from, of how you start to build that. But you start by knowing your own mind and knowing who you are.
How big a role do you think the initial team plays in creating these imprints, and how many people actually get a chance to participate in creating an imprint? Because I imagine at some stage, and we probably don't know exactly when, but the imprint has been created and it's probably quite early on.
Yeah, and we don't have an exact number, like you said, it's probably fading. But what's interesting to me is how much of this imprinting can even be unconscious. So there's another really awesome paper that I cite in the book that looks at imprinting of organizational roles. And they take the example of HR. And you can imagine if you hire an HR person, that HR person could do many different things, right? They can handle legal aspects of your business. They can handle recruiting. They can handle internal policies. So let's say you hire an HR person at a 50-person company and you grow to like a 300-person company. And you hire somebody who doesn't have legal background as your initial HR person.
Yeah.
As you grow to 300 people, you've now had to add a legal department to your organization. And once that the original HR person leaves, they've left a hole in the organization in the shape of their skills. So you can no longer hire an HR person who does legal stuff because you've had to build a legal department around the fact that that person didn't have those skills.
Yeah.
So we actually find that even those conscious choices about who to hire create shapes in the organization that linger for hundreds of years afterwards.
This is so fascinating and absolutely right. I've never thought about this way. It's so fascinating. Okay, so of course, as you can imagine, I could talk about culture for hours, but I think that for our listeners, it's also interesting to think about other aspects of a startup life. So we talked a little bit about raising money, about funding, about generating a good idea and developing a good idea. What advice do you have for people who need to pitch their idea? What are the main things to keep in mind to create a good presentation and really have an impact that you want to have on potential investors, for example?
So I know you want to get away from culture, but I will invoke culture in the zeitgeist sense once here, which is that what a good pitch looks like depends on when you're giving the pitch. So back in my startup days, when someone asked you for a pitch, you'd send them a 100-page business plan. That's not a joke. And today what you would do is when someone asks you for a pitch, you send them a very well-defined 10 to 12 slide deck that I describe in the book. And 5 years from now, you might send them a video game or play them a song. I don't know, right? So there's a cultural aspect to that. But the most important thing I think to learn about pitching is that to know about pitching is that pitching can be learned. So you can become better at pitching. We know that from research. And so spending time to get this right matters a lot. You should also know that pitching is partially about what you're actually saying, but partially about what you're doing. So there are very strong aspects of pitching outcomes that depend on how you're presenting yourself, that depend on how you're matching the quality of your company, the quality of your talk. And so it's a subtle thing, but something that you can get better at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think for more details, we should encourage our listeners to really check out your book, because there are details on how to prepare that deck and what exactly to include, and also how to present yourself during such a presentation. Fantastic. So I guess, one thing that is interesting for me is the future of entrepreneurship. We are going through really strange times. And I guess that a lot of people are wondering, are things going to change? What's going to be the impact of COVID-19 and other issues that we're facing right now on entrepreneurship? Are you seeing any changes already? And also, what is your forecast for the future?
So one of my colleagues, Phil Tetlock, studies forecasts of the future and tells us that nobody knows what's going to happen 5 years from now. And very few people know what's going to happen in the immediate future. So I think we are in the most uncertain time I've lived through. So I couldn't give you a clear prediction. I could tell you the trends that I'd be thinking about is there's been a collapse in venture funding. And there's also, and I think immigration flows in the US and the world are disrupted in ways that are interesting and potentially problematic for some countries. And that there's also, the way distance is handled is going to be interesting. So right now, pre-COVID, the average distance between a venture capitalist and a firm that invests in them was 80 miles.
80 miles. Wow.
80 miles, and 40% were within 3 miles between the venture capital headquarters and the company they invested headquarters. The result was very uneven flows of capital. So graduates from Penn, from where I teach, raised more money last year in venture capital than everybody in France and Germany put together. Wow. So there might be some more evenness in capital flows, maybe in talent. But I think that the positive message is entrepreneurship is all about change. And especially entrepreneurs who engage in sort of the modern approach to entrepreneurship, which is about experimentation and tailoring and learning as you go. I think it's an incredibly important time for entrepreneurs to step up to restore growth, to solve many of the problems that have just emerged, and take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So the one thing I'd urge entrepreneurs who are at an early stage to do is to think about, how does your idea work in this time of COVID? How are you solving the problems that have popped up? It's interesting. We were just discussing before the recording started about the many different podcasting software packages out there that have emerged, right? And I think, in the same way, I'm sure every one of the people who've listened to this has been on a Zoom call or a WebEx call or, a FaceTime call or whatever, Google Hangout. And I think that we all see the problems associated with all of these distance tools that are so relevant today. And I think founders should be thinking about, what are the flaws that have been exposed? And not necessarily, I want to launch a competitor to Zoom or to a major player, but how do I create a niche product that serves a market like, say, podcasting, that is better at that than everything else? So there's huge amounts of opportunities now. Big companies are stumbling. It's time for new growth. It's time to build. And I think that founders should be thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm. One last question that is related to the crisis that we're going through right now. What are you seeing in terms of how startups are weathering that storm, and what interesting pivots have you seen happen?
So I think it's a little early on the pivot side to see a lot of things. I have seen my students, I teach entrepreneurship at Wharton, so I have thousands of students. They've, I think, raised collectively over $1 billion of venture capital in my class and others over the years. And I do see them reacting to this. So a lot of them are very interested in their industries, which is, again, that effectual approach we talked about earlier, knowing who I am and what I know and who I know. And I think your listeners should think the same. What changes are happening in your industry that you'll need to adjust to? What companies big players are turning out to be inflexible in the face of this crisis? That's a great opportunity to look at. So I think people re-examining their own industry and thinking about their own employers and what they know and what they don't know is useful. We know crises like this actually can create booms in startups, either because people are forced to launch companies as their old companies fall apart or their jobs fall apart, but also because they see opportunities that other people don't. I mean, this will pass, right? There will be more booms in the future. So I think the people who are looking at this and understanding their own market and looking for opportunities to change, they're saying things like, wow, the insurance industry is inflexible in the face of this crisis. People can't work remotely. How do we fix that problem? Or I've seen lots of my students who are doctors think about what the future of telemedicine looks like now and what has been revealed about what people's preferences are. So I think it's a really good time to sit and think hard about these issues.
And absolutely. And observe how people engage with this new situation, what they want. It's fascinating. I'm doing a piece right now on pivots in startups. And so I've been interviewing a few interesting companies. And it's also another thing that I've noticed in how companies are facing this crisis right now with their business is that most of them, the trend that I have seen is that they really turned their back for a while at their original business model because it simply couldn't work, especially for those companies that relied on face-to-face interaction and at the same time remained really true and focused on their mission. And so they thought, okay, how can we serve that mission in a different way? And really interesting ideas have come up from this. So today, actually, I interviewed a company that's called Art Night, and their mission is to bring people together for educational and entertainment experiences, ranging from creating art together to making cocktails together. And last year, they connected 45,000 people across many countries in Europe. Yeah. And as you can imagine, in February, their business went from that number to zero. And so they had to really quickly think about, what do we do now? And came up with this really neat idea of doing similar thing virtually with a slightly different format where they ship all the ingredients that people need to their homes, and they've already recovered 40% of the lost revenue. So I think it's pretty amazing. Just one of many examples that I have seen where people were pivoting, but being focused on the reason their company exists. So I don't know if you,
I love that story. I mean, and you think about that. I mean, that's a huge advantage startups have. We were talking about culture getting fixed. Companies lose agility as time goes on. And so startups pivoting is the secret, right? And so, in fact, it's very explicitly the secret. So one of the clear indications about how startups succeed and why they beat large companies is this idea of experimentation and pivot. There's a really cool study out of Italy that showed that startups that were taught to use experimental methods to test hypotheses and to do formal testing of their startups' ideas and pivot as they needed to, had twice as high revenue a year later as those that didn't go through that process.
So, I would like a reference to this study, definitely. It sounds very interesting.
Happy to send it to you. It's in the book as well, but I'll send a link. But I think you're right? So there's this opportunity that if you're a large events company, it's going to be much harder to think about how you're going to pivot in a world where we're not doing in-person events. While if you're a startup, suddenly there's opportunity here, right? So what do people still want experiences? How do you give them experience virtually? And if that method doesn't work, how do we find another one?
And what was amazing speaking to them today is that they told me, going forward, actually we are stronger because we will continue with our business. Hopefully things are going back to normal in the countries where they operate. So they're going back to their live business, but now they have this new product. And they said what's amazing and inspiring about this is that now our reach is so much bigger because we can reach people in remote places in South Germany, for example, that don't live near a large city. So they would never have an opportunity to interact with someone in the UK and, I don't know, mix drinks together or bake breads together. So it's pretty amazing because they really have, I think, a really strong chance to double their revenue probably continuing forward if things go as planned. We never know because there might be another disruption. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think I love that idea of, what startups do is take crisis and turn it into opportunity. So I think that you're seeing exactly that happen. And, we're also in a period where consumers are more willing to do things because there's no other alternative, right? So a friend of startups is TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. So right now, there is no alternative to doing things remotely. So how do you take advantage of that? You don't have to have the world's best product. You need to have a product that does something.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and move to the section where we have questions from our listeners. Time for your questions.
Hi, Aga. This is Alison McTavish from Switzerland.
Hi, this is Dale Hintz. I'm submitting a question to the Culture Lab.
Hi, Aga. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the podcast.
I have a question for Culture Lab.
Hello, my name is Wharton from Denmark.
Hi, Ed. This is Tim Coupler.
Hi, I'm Kostas. I have a question for you, Michael.
I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for entertaining my question.
Hi, Ethan. This is Federico, and I have 3 questions for you. The first one is the following. Who do you consider to be the greatest entrepreneur of our generation?
So that's a really interesting question, Federico. And I'm going to be a little bit controversial here in that I'm going to say that picking the greatest entrepreneurs of our generation makes me very nervous. And it's actually kind of why The Unicorn Shadow was written, was to try and tear down some of these idols. Because the problem is people model themselves on these great entrepreneurs, right? And what happens is we look at somebody like Steve Jobs, who is a jerk and successful, or Mark Zuckerberg, who, has created a whole bunch of problems but was successful. And people then model themselves on these successful founders. And what you have is a success bias. These people look successful, but their techniques, we know actually from research, are the kinds of techniques that lead to failure more often than not. Like being nice beats being a jerk. So many of the founders that I think are very impressive are founders that you may not have heard of. And I think putting someone on a pedestal on founding takes their story and makes them an idol. And then we know people reject their own entrepreneurial story if it doesn't fit that idol. So I'm very consciously going to not give you a particular model to follow and encourage you to not get too obsessed with single success stories. That's the sort of idea of the research is the things that the most successful founders do, when you look back on them, are actually not great paths for other people to follow based on all the research and data that we have.
I suspected that you might give this answer having read your book. And I think you have already, in a way, started answering Federico's second question.
How do you define success in entrepreneurship? It is related on innovation, on the impact, on wealth, or on something else?
I like this. This is a very deep question, and I think so. With my academic or startup board member or startup co-founder hat on, success often looks like you successfully exit for lots of money, right? But actually, I think it's a very profound question because success means lots of different things. In fact, when I surveyed every living Wharton alumni from the business school a few years back with my colleague Matthew Bidwell, we actually asked not just about monetary success, but we asked about work-life balance, career satisfaction, job satisfaction. And we found that entrepreneurs were the most satisfied with their careers, with their jobs, and with their work-family balance. So I think that it's very reasonable to pick, going back to the conversation we had earlier about lifestyle businesses, to pick your own happiness, control over your own destiny, your ability to set your own time as useful outcomes for entrepreneurship. You don't necessarily have to get rich to be successful. Control and ability to do what you love are just as important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of studies about happiness that actually point in this direction. So they talk about a sense of control and also our ability to get a sense of fulfillment and meaning from what we're doing are really, really important to our happiness. So finally, he has a third question, and I think I will let him ask it.
What is the single most important characteristic of a great entrepreneur?
So I'm sorry to disappoint you again. I feel like I'm, saying that the questions themselves are really interesting to jump off from, but I can't give you a direct answer. But it's for a really interesting reason, which is that we have lots of studies looking at the personality characteristics of entrepreneurs. And it turns out that there is no single personality characteristic that is strongly predictive of entrepreneurial success. And this is a big myth that we have that I try and bust in the book. And there are personality characteristics that make you more likely to try and want to start a company. So for example, overconfidence is highly predictive of launching a company, but not of success. You think you're going to win, so you launch a company. It's kind of like you think you're going to be a rock star or hip hop artist and movie star. Most people don't succeed even if they're talented. So there isn't a single factor that predicts success from a personality perspective. And those personality perspectives, the personality characteristics that seem to help, depend on the kind of company you're launching. So there is not a single characteristic that helps. I will say the depressing news is family wealth certainly is predictive, and having family members who are founders, especially successful founders, is predictive of entrepreneurial success. Probably not what we wanted to hear, but seems to be very clear in the data.
Are there any other predictors of success apart from these two?
I mean, sure. So it turns out age is actually predictive of success, but not in the way you'd expect. So 20-something college dropouts, not as successful. The average age for an entrepreneur in the US, and we have some data suggesting similarly around the world, is 42. The average age for an entrepreneur to raise venture capital is 42. And the average age for a founder to achieve hypergrowth, to be the top 0.001% of all employers, are founders who are 45 to 59. So older founders are more likely to be successful. So there are, again, back to that effectuation principle, who you know, what you know, and the resources you have at hand are going to be much greater when you're older and more connected and have more money to spend, perhaps, than when you're younger and know less stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so let's move to the rapid fire questions. I have 5 questions for you, and you'll have 2 minutes to answer all of them. Okay?
All right. Tough for an academic, but I'm willing to give it a shot.
Let's go for it. So how do you define organizational culture?
Culture is the often unhidden aspects of an organization that tell people what to do, what not to do, and what methods should be used to achieve those things.
And tell me about the signs that you notice that tell you that the company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul.
So if the company is failing, that's a good sign. If there's misalignment between what the company says and what the company does, that's another good sign.
Are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
So I admire Zappos is a really interesting company. It's failed at cultural renaissance a couple times, but by trying and thinking about culture first, I think it's really cool, all the things that they've tried to do to make culture work even when they've failed.
Mm. What books on culture or on entrepreneurship, on leadership would you recommend to our listeners?
So I am a little bit of a fan of, leadership is what a leader does. And I think Heckman's book on running teams and leadership is a really useful one to look at. I think Ed Schein's book on culture is a really good one. On entrepreneurship, beside my own book, which I quite like, I'd also highly recommend Noam Wasserman's book on founders' dilemmas.
Mm-hmm. I like your book too, by the way.
Thank you.
And last question of this series, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Really good question. And that's a hard one to fit in the last 20 seconds, but I'll give my best guess at it, which is that be conscious of culture. It's way, way underemphasized. And that's not something I'm saying just because I'm on the Culture Lab podcast, but culture is so critical to startup success, so critical to why people want to work at your company, so critical to your future. Be conscious about it from the beginning. It's just as important as any other aspect or more than of your startup.
As you can imagine, I'm super glad to hear you say that. And what are your final thoughts? What final remarks would you like to leave our listeners with?
I think that you should. So the final remarks is a paper that just came out that I think is a really important one on culture that I talk to startups about all the time, which is showing that, people think of culture as trade-offs, right? That I can have a company that's high in individual autonomy, but then isn't good at everyone working cooperatively together. Or I can people can be really good about trying to seek out huge success, but may have trouble in working for the common good. And there's a really nice new paper that came out, and I'll send you a link to it, that shows that this is entirely wrong, that actually you can't have it all. Cultures can be good at innovation and good at collective work. They can be good at giving people individual control, and they can be good and prioritizing success and also doing good for the world. So I think this idea of going in with trade-offs is a really dangerous way to go. Try and build a company that's good at everything and is good for the world. And that's where I would want to be.
Thank you so much. If our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, definitely a good place to go is Amazon. I think nowadays probably not a brick and mortar bookstore, and get your book. But where else can people find more about you and your work?
Sure. So if you go to unicorns-shadow.com, which is the website for the book, I have tons of resources that I've collected. So lots of links to free stuff on the web and more information at the book. You can also buy the book there from Wharton Press directly, which is DRM free, which is useful if you're in Europe or Asia and you just want to get a copy. Please don't share it. And then obviously I have a Twitter feed that is really active where I post all the latest academic research papers that are kind of interesting. So at Mollick, EMOLLICK.
That's awesome. And it's so good to really, I would encourage everyone who listens to this to follow, because there are so many myths about entrepreneurship. And so I love your approach of really trying to find evidence for what we believe about what works and what doesn't work in entrepreneurship. So yes, absolutely. Listeners, please follow so that you know what is true and what is really just a myth. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And I hope that we can have you back at some time in the future.
Great. I loved it too. Thank you so much.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcasts and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. Before I give you a sneak peek into the next episode, here's just a quick reminder of where you can download your guide to a company playbook. Just go to my website, agabayer.com, that's agabajer.com. Look at the top right corner and you'll see the resources tab over there. So just hover above it and you'll see the guide right there, alongside other useful resources that you might want to use to work on your company culture. Speaking of which, a good company playbook consists of what I call the Big Five: mission, vision, philosophy, core values, and core desired feelings. And my next guest is a serial entrepreneur, Darius Mirshazda. And as you will hear, Darius had grown one of his businesses from 30 to 1,000 people with virtually zero growing pains. And he credits all of this to his relentless focus on the company's core values. Darius is such a huge believer in the power of core values that he's written a book, The Core Values Equation, and in my next interview, you'll have an opportunity to hear him talk about his experience of scaling a business and building an awesome company culture. And now, a short preview of our conversation.
It all starts with the foundation of success and growth and scale, in my book. The widest part of that foundation and the thickest part of that foundation are your core values. My business, I grew it from 30 to 1,000 employees in 3 years. And when you're growing a business, and the first part of it, the one I just left and exited, we grew from 30 to 313 employees in 18 months. And I had zero growing pains because of what I did with the values. I give 100% credit to the way we designed and implemented the values.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.